Good evening. Find a comfortable position and let the room go quiet. If you are here to sleep, this is the right place. Dim the lights if you can. Let your shoulders drop from wherever they have been. Tonight, we are going somewhere quiet, somewhere shadowed, somewhere that looks, on the surface, almost peaceful. Bedroom, heavy curtains drawn against the daylight. A woman lying still beneath the covers, hands folded, eyes closed. It looks like rest. It looks, if you glance at it quickly, like exactly what a tired body needs. It is 1880, and the woman in that bed has just been forbidden to read. She has been forbidden to write. She has been forbidden to sew or sit up without asking, or turn onto her side without a nurse's permission. She will spend the next 6 to 8 weeks exactly like this, in the dark, being fed more food than her body wants, gaining weight she never asked to gain, losing the use of muscles she is no longer allowed to move. She has not committed a crime. She has not been imprisoned by the state. She is a wealthy, educated woman who went to a respected physician because she felt exhausted and sad, and this is what he prescribed. The most fashionable medical treatment in the Western world. They called it the rest cure. And by the time we are finished tonight, you will understand why so many of the women who survived it never fully described what it had done to them. Settle in. We have a long night ahead, and there is a great deal to understand. Tonight, we are going to follow a woman through 6 weeks of a Victorian medical treatment that was considered, at the time, the height of scientific compassion. Not a punishment, not a prison sentence. A cure prescribed by some of the most respected doctors in America and Britain for women who were tired, or sad, or restless, or simply too intelligent for the narrow life they had been given. The version of Victorian women's health that most of us carry is a soft one: fainting couches, smelling salts, a delicate lady reclining in a sunlit parlor while a doctor takes her pulse and prescribes a change of scenery. It is a version built by costume, dramas, and gift shop postcards, and it has almost nothing to do with what actually happened inside these rooms. The real version is this: a diagnosis called hysteria, so broad and so vague that it could be applied to nearly any woman a husband or father found inconvenient. A neurologist named Silas Weir Mitchell, whose treatment became so influential that refusing it could mark a woman as uncooperative, even dangerous to her own recovery. Cure that stripped away a patient's books, her correspondence, her conversation, and eventually her sense of who she was, and called the resulting blankness health. By the end of tonight, you will understand what the rest cure actually required of the women who endured it. And you will understand why one of them, a writer named Charlotte Perkins Gilman, turned her own 6 weeks of forced silence into one of the most unsettling stories in American literature, and mailed a copy directly to the doctor who had tried to cure her of thinking. Before we go any further, if this kind of evening suits you, if you like settling in with history that feels like a place you can visit rather than a list of dates to memorize, would you take a moment to subscribe? It costs nothing, but it helps more than you might think, and it means we can keep making these. And if you feel like it, tell me in the comments where you are tonight and what time it is where you are. I always read them. Wherever you are, I am glad you are here. Now let us go to 1880. Let us go to a quiet street in a quiet city, where a curtained window on the second floor has not been opened in 3 weeks. The decade is a strange one to sit inside. Outside these curtained windows, the world is moving faster than it has ever moved before. Railroads crisscross the continent carrying letters and newspapers and strangers between cities that a generation ago felt impossibly distant from one another. The telephone has just been invented, though it will be years before it reaches most households. Electric light is beginning to flicker in the wealthiest homes and the busiest streets, a strange, steady glow that makes gaslight look, by comparison, almost medieval. Photography has matured from a novelty into an industry. Newspapers print more pages, more editions, more advertisements than they ever have. The pace of information itself, the sheer volume of things a person is expected to know and respond to, has accelerated beyond anything the previous century prepared people for. Consider what a single generation has witnessed. A woman of 40 in 1880 was born into a world without railroads reaching most of the country, without the telegraph, without photography, without anesthesia in common surgical use. She has watched the entire structure of daily life reorganize itself around speed, connection, information, delivered faster than any human nervous system evolved to process it comfortably. Letters that once took weeks to arrive now arrive in days. News of a distant disaster, once a rumor that might take months to confirm, now appears in the morning paper within hours of the event itself. This acceleration touched every household, wealthy and poor alike, and physicians of the era, watching their patients struggle to keep pace with a world reorganizing itself this quickly, reached for an explanation that made sense within their existing framework. Not that the pace of modern life itself might be truly difficult for any human being to sustain, but that certain nervous systems, weaker by constitution, were simply unequipped to withstand it. There is a quiet irony worth noticing here, one that the physicians of this era were not positioned to see. The same industrial and technological forces reshaping the world outside the sick room, the railroads, the factories, the accelerating pace of commerce, were themselves largely built and directed by men. Women, for the most part, experienced this acceleration second-hand through the husbands and fathers who came home exhausted from the offices and exchanges where the new pace of life was actually being lived. And yet, it was women's nerves that bore the diagnostic weight of this transformation most heavily. Women who were told, again and again, that their bodies were too fragile to withstand a world they had comparatively little hand in accelerating in the first place. Physicians of the era have a name for what this acceleration is doing to the human nervous system. They call it neurasthenia, a weakness of the nerves, a kind of exhaustion that they believe is a direct byproduct of modern civilization. The theory holds that the body carries a finite, unrenewable store of nervous energy, something like a bank account that can be drawn down but never fully replenished. Every letter written, every book read, every worry entertained, every emotional shock absorbed, withdraws from that account. Spend it too quickly, the theory goes, and the nerves collapse under the strain, producing insomnia, anxiety, fatigue, digestive trouble, and a long list of vague, overlapping symptoms that doctors struggle to categorize. This diagnosis, for all its strangeness, is applied to men as well as women. Businessmen, lawyers, clergymen, all of them can be neurasthenic. All of them can be told by their physicians that their nerves have simply run dry from the pressures of modern professional life. But for women, there is an older, darker word waiting behind neurasthenia, one that has existed in Western medicine for over 2,000 years. And it is the word that will define this evening's story, hysteria. The word comes from the ancient Greek hystra, meaning womb, and the diagnosis it names has one of the strangest histories in the story of medicine. The ancient Greeks believed that a woman's uterus was capable of moving through her body of its own accord, wandering upward toward the chest or the throat when it was deprived of what it wanted, which was, according to the physicians of antiquity, regular intercourse and frequent pregnancy. A wandering womb pressing against the lungs could cause breathlessness. Pressing against the throat, it could cause the sensation of choking. Pressing against the brain, it might produce fits, tears, fainting, or wild, uncontrollable behavior. The cure, in ancient medicine, was to coax the womb back into its proper place, usually through marriage, sex, or childbirth. This theory did not simply fade away with the advance of anatomical science, the way we might expect a disproven medical idea to disappear. It persisted, remarkably, for well over 2,000 years, adapting itself to each new era's medical vocabulary, without ever fully abandoning its original premise. Physicians of the medieval period elaborated on the wandering womb with treatments involving foul-smelling substances held near a woman's face, intended to drive the errant organ back downward by repelling it, alongside sweet-smelling preparations applied near the pelvis, intended to lure it back into place through attraction. Physicians of the 17th and 18th centuries began to abandon the literal, physical wandering of the uterus as anatomical study made the idea increasingly untenable, but the underlying assumption that a woman's reproductive organs were the primary source of any psychological or emotional disturbance she experienced survived the collapse of the specific mechanism that had once explained it. The organ stopped moving in medical theory. Its supposed influence over the female mind did not. By 1880, no reputable physician believes that a uterus can physically travel through the body. The scientific understanding of anatomy has long since dismissed the literal wandering womb. But the word hysteria has survived the theory that created it, drifting loose from its original explanation and settling onto something even more useful to the society that continues to employ it. It has become a catch-all. A diagnosis broad enough to explain almost any symptom a woman might present, and vague enough to place the judgment of what counts as illness entirely in the hands of her physician, who is, in nearly every case, a man. There is something worth naming plainly about a diagnosis constructed this way. A disease with a precise physical cause can be tested against evidence. A tumor can be located. Fracture can be seen on close examination. A fever can be measured and tracked. Hysteria offered no such anchor. Its symptom list was so expansive, and its underlying cause so thoroughly untethered from any observable physical mechanism, that it could not meaningfully be disproven by any single case. This is not how legitimate medical science is supposed to function, and even by the standards of an era that had not yet developed rigorous protocols for clinical evidence. Some physicians of the period privately expressed unease about how loosely the diagnosis was being applied. But unease did not translate into meaningful reform. The diagnosis was too useful, too perfectly suited to the social function it had come to serve, for that unease to gain real traction within the profession. A woman who is anxious might be hysterical. A woman who is exhausted after childbirth might be hysterical. A woman who cries too often or too rarely might be hysterical. A woman who wants a life beyond her household, who reads too many novels, who writes essays, who asks too many questions of her husband or her doctor, who simply seems restless within the narrow domestic role assigned to her, might be hysterical too. The diagnosis does not require a consistent set of physical symptoms. It requires only that a woman's behavior deviate in some direction her physician finds notable from the standard of quiet, compliant femininity that Victorian society has established as the baseline of health. The scale of this diagnosis, once it took hold, is worth pausing over. Medical texts of the era describe hysteria as one of the most commonly diagnosed conditions among women of the leisured and educated classes, a condition so pervasive that some physicians writing decades later, looking back on the period, estimated that a substantial majority of the female patients they treated across their careers had received the label. This was not a rare or exotic diagnosis reserved for the most severely disturbed. It was for a certain class of woman in this era, closer to an ordinary hazard of adult life, something a woman might reasonably expect to encounter in some form before her middle years, in the same way she might expect to encounter childbirth or bereavement. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is the foundation of everything we are about to witness. In an era when medical science is advancing rapidly in nearly every other field, when surgeons are beginning to understand antisepsis, when researchers are identifying the bacteria behind disease after disease, the medical understanding of the female mind remains rooted in assumptions that predate the microscope. Predate most of recorded history. The doctors treating hysterical women in 1880 are not incompetent by the standards of their era. Many of them are brilliant, methodical, deeply committed to their patients' well-being as they understand it. The tragedy is not a failure of intelligence. It is a failure of imagination, a complete inability to consider that the women in front of them might be responding rationally to intolerable circumstances, rather than suffering from a defect built into their bodies. It is worth pausing here too on the question of who could access this diagnosis and this treatment, because the answer reveals something important about the rescuer's place in the broader hierarchy of Victorian life. Mitchell's regimen was expensive. It required a private room, a dedicated nurse, a physician's regular attention, and enough household income to absorb the cost of a wife's or daughter's productive absence from domestic labor for 6 to 8 weeks at a time. This was not a treatment available to working-class women who could not afford the private nursing care it demanded, and who in any case could rarely be spared from the labor their households depended on, whether that labor was paid work outside the home or the unpaid domestic work that kept a poorer family functioning. A working-class woman exhibiting the same symptoms, the same exhaustion and despair, was far more likely to be diagnosed, if she received any formal diagnosis at all, with simple overwork, or to receive no medical attention whatsoever, her suffering absorbed silently into the ordinary hardship expected of her class. The rest cure, in this sense, was a particular kind of privilege, available almost exclusively to the wives and daughters of men wealthy enough to afford it. And its existence tells us something specific about the anxieties of that class. Wealthy Victorian society had, in a sense, enough surplus resource to notice and formally pathologize the distress of its women, distress that poorer women experienced in equal or greater measure, but that their society had no comparable framework or comparable financial incentive to name and treat. Into this medical climate steps a physician who will, more than any other single figure, define how hysteria and its sister diagnosis, neurasthenia, are treated for the next several decades. His name is Silas Weir Mitchell. Mitchell practices in Philadelphia, a city that by 1880 has become one of the great centers of American medicine. He is not, at this point in his career, an obscure figure. He served as a military surgeon during the Civil War, where he studied nerve injuries among wounded soldiers with a precision that established his early reputation. He is also, somewhat unusually for a physician of his standing, a published novelist and poet, a man who moves comfortably between the world of clinical medicine and the world of literary Philadelphia, dining with writers and intellectuals, cultivating an image of himself. In 1877, Mitchell publishes a book called Fat and Blood, a slim volume that will become one of the most consequential medical texts of the century. In it, he lays out with the confidence of a man who believes he has solved a truly difficult problem: his complete system for treating nervous exhaustion. He describes his typical patient in language that reveals, more clearly than any modern analysis could, exactly how he understood the women who came to him for help. Nervous women, he writes, who as a rule are thin and lack blood. Women who have passed through many hands, been treated in turn for gastric, spinal, or uterine troubles, and remained, at the end, as at the beginning, invalids. There is real contempt buried in that description, and it matters, because contempt shaped the treatment that followed. Mitchell did not see himself as unlocking the mysteries of the female mind. He saw himself as correcting a widespread failure of discipline, a class of women who had, in his view, indulged their weaknesses until those weaknesses became chronic. His solution would not be gentle. It would be systematic, comprehensive, and, as we are about to see in detail, almost totalizing in its control over every aspect of a patient's physical existence. Mitchell was not operating in isolation, and the rest cure did not emerge from nothing. It arrived into a medical culture already saturated with treatments for hysteria that ranged from the merely unhelpful to the outright bizarre. And understanding that broader world of Victorian gynecological medicine helps explain why a treatment as extreme as Mitchell's could be so readily accepted as compassionate, scientific care. Physicians of the mid to late 19th century, still working within a medical framework that traced hysteria back to disorders of the reproductive organs, developed an entire category of treatments aimed directly at the pelvis. Manual pelvic massage, performed by physicians in their consulting rooms, was recommended for hysterical patients well into the 1,880 seconds and beyond, understood at the time as a legitimate therapeutic procedure rather than anything requiring special scrutiny. Precisely because the medical establishment did not yet think to question whether a treatment's mechanism made sense outside the framework that had produced it. The invention of mechanical and eventually electrical devices to perform this same function more efficiently followed naturally from this existing practice, marketed to physicians not as anything scandalous, but as a labor-saving instrument. No different in spirit from any other piece of medical equipment designed to make a tedious procedure faster and more consistent. Other treatments popular in the decades surrounding Margaret's story included prolonged immersion in cold baths, believed to shock the nervous system back into proper function, and, in more severe cases, the surgical removal of the ovaries, a procedure that came to be known as normal ovariotomy, performed on women whose symptoms had been deemed serious enough to warrant an operation that, from a modern vantage point, amounts to permanent, irreversible harm inflicted in pursuit of curing behavior rather than disease. The fact that a woman's reproductive organs could be surgically altered or removed on the theory that doing so might calm her temperament tells you more clearly than any single case history could how thoroughly Victorian medicine had conflated a woman's body with her mind, and how willing that medicine was to intervene on the body in pursuit of controlling the mind. Against this backdrop, Mitchell's rescue could present itself, and largely was received as the gentler, more humane alternative. There was no surgery involved, no invasive internal procedures performed in a physician's office. Simply rest, food, and quiet, the very language of nurture and care. This branding, sincere as Mitchell himself believed it to be, mattered enormously to how readily the treatment spread. A regimen that could be described in polite society as rest, nourishment, and freedom from the exhausting demands of ordinary life required no defense against accusations of cruelty. It sounded, on its surface, like exactly the kindness a tired woman deserved. Only inside the actual rooms where the treatment was administered did the gap between that gentle description and the lived experience of isolation, force feeding, and psychological control become fully apparent, and by then, the women inside those rooms had little power to correct the public record. Mitchell's own reputation only grew in the years following the publication of Fat and Blood. He became the physician of choice for wealthy families across the eastern seaboard, his name carrying enough authority that a diagnosis of nervous exhaustion, followed by his recommended course of treatment, was rarely questioned by the husbands and fathers who arranged it. He corresponded with physicians across the country and eventually across the Atlantic, training a generation of doctors in his methods, so that by the 1882nd, a version of the rest cure, sometimes administered by Mitchell himself, but far more often by physicians who had studied his writing and adopted his framework, was available in nearly every major city in the United States and in much of Britain as well. Let us go and meet one of those women. The woman we are going to follow tonight is a composite drawn from the case histories, letters, and diaries of real women who underwent the rest cure in the 1880 seconds, including accounts published by Mitchell himself in his medical writing and the far more revealing private letters of his patients. We will call her Margaret Ellis Winthrop. She is 31 years old, married for 6 years to a successful attorney named Henry Winthrop, and mother to 2 children, a boy of 4 and a girl of 18 months. She lives in a comfortable brownstone in a respectable eastern city, the kind of house with a parlor for receiving guests, a nursery on the 3rd floor, and a small study off the master bedroom that used to be, before her marriage, entirely her own. Margaret was, before all of this, considered unusually bright. She was educated at a female seminary that offered more rigorous coursework than most institutions of its kind, and she read voraciously as a girl, everything from novels to essays, to the occasional volume of natural philosophy that she borrowed somewhat furtively from her father's library. She wrote poetry as a young woman, some of it published under a modest pseudonym in a regional literary magazine. Her correspondence before her marriage is full of opinions about books, about politics, cautiously expressed but present nonetheless, about the constraints she already sensed closing around her as she approached the age when marriage would be expected. Her father, a schoolteacher of modest means but genuine intellectual conviction, had encouraged her curiosity in ways that were not entirely typical for his era, teaching her Latin alongside her brothers, allowing her the run of his small but carefully chosen library, and engaging her in dinner-table discussions of history and philosophy that most of her female contemporaries never experienced in their own homes. He had, in his quieter moments, expressed hope that Margaret might one day pursue some form of serious intellectual work, perhaps teaching, perhaps writing in some more sustained capacity than the occasional magazine verse. He died when Margaret was 19, before her marriage, and something of that specific, hopeful vision of her future life died with him, replaced by the more conventional expectations of the aunts and family friends who oversaw her transition into adult womanhood. She married Henry for reasons that were, by the standards of her era, entirely sound. He was kind, in the way that Victorian husbands were generally understood to be kind, which is to say, he did not drink to excess, did not raise his hand to her, and provided for his household with the steady competence of a man building a respectable career. He admired her intelligence when they were courting. He found her opinions charming in the way that a certain kind of man finds a woman's intelligence charming right up until it becomes inconvenient. Their courtship, in its early months, had truly delighted her. Henry brought her books he thought she would enjoy, engaged her in long conversations at dinner parties while other young men drifted toward safer, lighter topics, and seemed, in those early exchanges, to take real pleasure in her willingness to disagree with him. She remembers, even now, one afternoon walk in the months before their engagement, arguing companionably with him about a novel they had both read, Henry conceding a point with visible good humor rather than the wounded defensiveness she had encountered in other suitors. Was this quality, more than his income or his prospects, that had convinced her he might make a marriage bearable, even good? She had allowed herself, in those months, a cautious hope that her marriage might not require the complete surrender of self that she had watched claim so many of her friends. The inconvenience began, as it so often did, with domestic life. Margaret's household responsibilities expanded steadily after her marriage. The management of servants, the social obligations of a rising attorney's wife, the calls to be made and received, the dinners to be planned, the correspondence to be maintained with a widening circle of acquaintances whose good opinion mattered to Henry's career. Then came children, first the boy, then, 4 years later, the girl, and with each birth came weeks of recovery, months of exhaustion, and a narrowing of the world down to the nursery, the parlor, and the increasingly rare hour when Margaret might sit alone with a book before her eyes grew too heavy to continue reading. She stopped writing poetry some time after her son was born. She could not have said exactly when. There was no single decision, no moment when she set down her pen and declared that this part of her life was finished. It simply became harder to find the time, then harder to find the energy, and then, eventually, harder to find the desire. Because desire itself requires a kind of energy that her days no longer left available. By the winter of 1880, something in Margaret has begun unmistakably to fray. She sleeps poorly, waking in the small hours of the morning, with her heart racing for no reason. She weeps without warning, sometimes over nothing at all. Broken dish, a delayed letter, the slant of grey light through the parlor window on an overcast afternoon. She finds herself unable to concentrate on the household accounts she has always managed with ease. She feels, most of the time, a heaviness that she cannot locate in any specific part of her body, but that seems to sit over her entire existence like a low, persistent fog. Henry notices. He is not an unkind man, and his concern, when it surfaces, is genuine. He watches his wife move through her days with an increasingly hollow quality, and he worries, in the language available to him, that something in her has broken. He does what a responsible husband of his class and era is expected to do. Sends for a physician. The physician who examines Margaret is respected, careful, and thoroughly a product of his medical education. He asks about her sleep, her appetite, her monthly cycles, her emotional state. He notes her thinness, her pallor, the slight tremor in her hands. He listens with genuine attention as Margaret describes her exhaustion, though he does not think to ask what, specifically, has exhausted her. He does not ask about the poetry she no longer writes. He does not ask whether the endless management of a household and 2 small children, performed largely without acknowledgement or relief, might itself be sufficient explanation for a woman's collapse. Those questions do not occur to him, because the medical framework he has been trained in does not include them as relevant variables. His diagnosis, delivered with the calm authority of a man entirely confident in his conclusion, is neurasthenia, verging toward hysteria. Nervous exhaustion brought on, in his estimation, by Margaret's inherently delicate constitution, and he suggests gently, by an excess of intellectual habit carried over from her unmarried years. Women, he explains to Henry in the hallway outside the bedroom, in the distant clinical tone that doctors of this era use when explaining a wife's condition to her husband rather than to the wife herself, possess nervous systems that were simply not built to withstand sustained mental exertion. Reading, writing, the pursuit of ideas beyond the domestic sphere, These activities draw vital energy away from a woman's proper functions, leaving her depleted, fragile, and, in Margaret's case, dangerously close to a complete nervous collapse. The recommendation follows within the week. Margaret's case, the physician believes, calls for something more comprehensive than rest at home, where the demands of the household will inevitably intrude. He recommends the treatment developed by the celebrated Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell of Philadelphia, whose methods, though Mitchell himself will not personally attend every case, have been adopted by physicians across the country under his direct instruction and correspondence. 6 to 8 weeks under close medical supervision, designed to restore the depleted nervous system to full health. Henry agrees without much deliberation. He loves his wife in his way, and he wants desperately for her to return to the woman he married, cheerful and capable and undemanding of his attention beyond what a household requires. He does not fully understand what the treatment involves. He knows only that it is expensive, fashionable, and endorsed by men whose medical judgment he has no reason to doubt. Margaret is told by her husband that she will be undertaking a course of rest. The word itself sounds almost pleasant, almost like a kindness. She has no idea on the evening before the treatment begins what the word actually means. The treatment begins on a Monday morning in late January, in a private room arranged by the physician in a quiet residential house that specializes discreetly in the care of nervous patients. Margaret is not sent to Philadelphia to Mitchell himself, though her physician corresponds with him regularly about difficult cases. Instead, she is placed under the supervision of a local doctor who has trained in Mitchell's methods and a nurse who has overseen dozens of these treatments before, a woman named Miss Halloran, whose manner is brisk, professional, and entirely unmoved by protest. Margaret arrives at 7 in the morning, accompanied by Henry, who kisses her forehead in the hallway with an expression of such genuine hope that Margaret finds herself, despite everything, wanting to reassure him. She tells him she will be well soon. He believes it mostly because she has no framework yet for understanding what 6 weeks in this room will actually require of her. The room itself is not unpleasant to look at, not at first. It is a comfortable bedroom on the second floor of the house, with a large bed, a small writing desk pushed against the far wall, out of reach, and heavy curtains that Miss Halloran draws closed within minutes of Margaret's arrival, reducing the January daylight to a thin grey seam along the window's edge. The wallpaper is a faded floral pattern, roses on a cream background, the kind of decoration meant to be soothing, unremarkable, forgettable. Margaret does not yet know how many hours she will spend staring at that wallpaper, how thoroughly she will come to know every repetition of its pattern, every place where the paper has begun to peel slightly at the seams. The room smells, in these first hours, of nothing distinct, the neutral, faintly dusty smell of a well-kept bedroom that has been aired recently and furnished with clean linens. This will change over the following weeks as the sealed windows and the constant low fire in the small grate combine to give the air a heavier, more stagnant quality, a mixture of coal smoke, warmed bedding, and the close stagnant quality of a room that receives no fresh air from one week to the next. Margaret does not notice this change happening in real time, the way she might notice a sudden shift. It arrives the way most confinements arrive. Gradually, one day's air very slightly less fresh than the day before. Until weeks in, she can no longer clearly recall what the room smelled like on that first afternoon. The furniture beyond the bed is sparse and functional. A single upholstered chair, positioned for the physician's visits, its fabric a deep, unremarkable green that Margaret will come to know as intimately as the wallpaper itself. A washstand in the corner, with a porcelain basin and pitcher that Miss Halloran refills each morning. The small writing desk, its surface bare, its drawers empty of anything Margaret might use to occupy herself. Present in the room less as a functional object than as a kind of taunt, a reminder of an activity that exists just beyond her reach, close enough to see. Miss Halloran explains the rules with the flat efficiency of someone reciting instructions she has given many times before. Margaret will remain in bed. She will not sit up except when necessary, and even then only with assistance. She will not read. She will not write. She will not sew or knit or engage in any activity that requires sustained use of her hands or her mind. She will not receive visitors, not her husband, not her children, not her mother who has written asking to call. She will not receive letters, and any she attempts to write will be intercepted and returned to her unsent by the nurse. She will be bathed by Miss Halloran. She will be fed by Miss Halloran. If she wishes to turn over in bed, she is to ask permission first, so that the nurse can assist her and ensure the movement does not tax her strength unnecessarily. Margaret listens to this list with a growing, quiet disbelief that she is careful not to show on her face, because she has already absorbed from a lifetime of careful socialization that visible distress will be read as evidence of the very hysteria she is here to be cured of. She asks tentatively whether she might at least be permitted her Bible, a small volume she has carried since girlhood, its spine soft with handling. Miss Halloran's answer is polite but final. No reading material of any kind. The mind, Miss Halloran explains, using language she has clearly been trained to repeat, must be given the same complete rest as the body. Any exertion, no matter how small it might seem, works against the cure. The first day passes with an unhurried strangeness that Margaret will later struggle to describe accurately, because so little happens that the hours themselves seem to lose their shape. She lies in the dim room, propped against pillows, ranged by Miss Halloran at what the nurse considers the correct angle, and she watches the thin line of daylight along the window's edge shift almost imperceptibly as the hours pass. She is fed at intervals, a heavy, milky breakfast that leaves her feeling uncomfortably full within the first hour, and then, before that fullness has fully passed, a midday meal nearly as substantial, rich with butter and cream and meat prepared in ways designed to pack the maximum possible nutrition into the smallest possible portion. This is the beginning of the feeding regimen that will define the physical experience of the cure as much as the enforced stillness. Mitchell's theory, laid out in exhaustive detail in Fat and Blood, holds that nervous exhaustion depletes the blood itself, thinning it, weakening it, and that the remedy is aggressive, sustained overfeeding, designed to rebuild blood volume, and with it, nervous strength. Patients under this regimen are expected to consume enormous quantities of milk, sometimes several quarts a day, along with butter, cream, and red meat, far beyond what their sedentary, motionless bodies could possibly need or comfortably process. The specifics of Mitchell's prescribed diet, recorded in careful detail in his own writing, would strike a modern physician as almost punitive in their excess. A patient might be required to drink a full glass of milk every 2 hours throughout the day, in addition to 3 substantial meals built around red meat, eggs, and heavy cream sauces. The entire regimen designed to push caloric intake far beyond what an active, healthy adult would require, let alone a woman confined to bed with no opportunity for exercise. Mitchell was aware that this feeding schedule would likely produce discomfort, even distress, in the early days of treatment, and he addressed this directly in his writing, instructing physicians to persist regardless. Dawned on the theory that the patient's digestive complaints were themselves symptoms of the nervous disorder rather than a rational response to genuine physical overload. Some patients, in cases recorded in the medical literature of the period, developed symptoms that we would now recognize as a direct consequence of overfeeding rather than any underlying nervous condition. Digestive distress. Significant, rapid weight gain that left patients struggling with mobility even after the treatment concluded. In a small number of documented cases, physicians noted symptoms consistent with what modern medicine would identify as gallbladder complications, a direct physiological consequence of a diet built almost entirely around fat and cream, administered to a body given no opportunity to metabolize it through any form of physical activity. None of these complications were understood at the time as evidence against the treatment's underlying logic. They were understood, instead, as further evidence of the patient's constitutional weakness, additional symptoms to be managed through further application of the same regimen that had produced them. By the end of the first day, Margaret's stomach aches with a dull, persistent pressure that has nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with its opposite. She says nothing about this to Miss Halloran, partly out of the ingrained deference that shapes every interaction she has ever had with an authority figure, and partly because she senses correctly that complaint will not be received as useful information. It will be received as a symptom, evidence that the nerves remain unsettled, that the cure has further to go. Night falls, though. Inside the curtained room, the transition from day to night is marked less by any visible change in light, and more by the sounds of the house settling around her. Footsteps on the stairs, a door closing somewhere below, the distant, muffled murmur of voices that Margaret cannot quite make out. Miss Halloran sleeps in a small cot at the foot of Margaret's bed, a detail that Margaret finds, on this first night, oddly disorienting. She has not shared a room with anyone but her husband in 6 years of marriage, and the presence of this watchful, professionally kind stranger, positioned to observe her through the night, adds a layer of surveillance to an already strange and disorienting day. Margaret lies awake for a long time before sleep finally takes her, staring at the faint outline of the window and thinking, with a clarity that surprises her, about the poem she was composing in her head just 3 days ago before the physician's visit. She cannot now remember the third line. She reaches for it in the darkness and finds only the shape of where it used to be. And something about that small, specific loss frightens her more than anything else that has happened today. The days that follow settle into a rhythm that Margaret comes to know with a precision that feels, in its own way, almost obscene. She wakes when Miss Halloran opens the curtains a few inches to admit the pale morning light, never fully, only enough to signal that morning has arrived, without actually illuminating the room. She is washed with a cloth and warm water, a process Miss Halloran performs with brisk, businesslike hands, moving over Margaret's body with none of the intimacy the act might imply, and all of the efficiency of a task to be completed before the next task begins. Breakfast follows immediately after, the same heavy, milky preparation as the day before, and Margaret learns, within the first week, that the amount of food will not decrease, no matter how full she becomes. Miss Halloran watches her eat with the patient, immovable attention of someone accustomed to resistance and entirely unimpressed by it. When Margaret, on the third morning, pushes the bowl away half-finished and says quietly that she cannot manage any more, Miss Halloran's response is gentle but absolutely firm. The doctor has prescribed a specific quantity of nourishment, she explains, and the body's protests, uncomfortable as they are not a reliable guide to what it actually needs. Margaret finishes the bowl. It takes nearly half an hour, and by the end, she is fighting a nausea that she has learned already. Not to mention aloud, the hours between meals stretch in a way that Margaret has never experienced. At home, even her most tedious afternoons were punctuated by tasks, small as they were: the checking of household accounts, a note to be written, a child's torn stocking to be mended. Here, there is nothing. She is not permitted to occupy her hands. She is not permitted to occupy her mind with anything beyond her own thoughts, which, deprived of any external material to work with, begins circling the same narrow territory again and again. Her children. Whether her son is eating well without her supervision, whether her daughter has taken her first unsteady steps in the nursery upstairs without her mother present to see it. Henry, and whether he is managing, and what he tells visitors when they ask after his wife's health. She is not permitted to know the answers to any of these questions, because letters are forbidden in both directions and visitors are turned away at the door. This isolation, total and absolute, is not an incidental feature of the treatment. It is, according to Mitchell's own writing, one of its essential mechanisms. The theory holds that a nervous patient's exhaustion is worsened by the emotional demands of family life, by the constant low-grade drain of worrying about others, managing their needs, absorbing their moods. Removing the patient entirely from that web of relationships, the thinking goes, allows her nervous system to recover without the interference of ordinary human attachment. What this means in practice for a woman like Margaret is that she spends 6 weeks not knowing whether her children are well. She spends 6 weeks unable to write even the briefest reassurance to her husband, unable to receive even the briefest reassurance from him. The isolation that is meant to heal her instead becomes its own distinct source of suffering, a low, constant undercurrent of worry that has nowhere to go and no outlet through which to resolve itself. The sounds of the house become, in the absence of any other form of stimulation, an entire universe of information that Margaret learns to interpret with the precision of a scholar studying a difficult text. She learns the exact rhythm of the housemaid's footsteps on the stairs, distinct from Miss Halloran's, distinct again from the heavier, more deliberate tread of the physician on his twice-weekly visits. She learns to identify, from the muffled sounds that occasionally drift up from the street below, roughly what time of day it must be. The rattle of a milk cart in the early morning, the specific density of carriage traffic that builds toward midday and thins again as evening approaches. Deprived of a clock, she is permitted to consult freely, deprived of books, deprived of conversation beyond Miss Halloran's brisk, functional exchanges. Margaret's mind fastens onto whatever fragments of the outside world manage to penetrate the curtained room and processes them with an intensity that would have seemed, in her previous life, entirely disproportionate to their importance. She thinks often in these early weeks about a specific kind of hunger that has nothing to do with food, a hunger for conversation, for the simple back and forth exchange of ideas that she did not fully appreciate in her life before this room. She misses arguing gently with Henry over the dinner table about some point in the newspaper. She misses the letters she used to exchange with her sister 3 states away, full of opinions about books and family gossip and the small, ordinary observations that make up the texture of an ongoing friendship. All of this has been suspended indefinitely, replaced by Miss Halloran's professional, limited conversation and the physician's brief, clinical questions about her sleep and her appetite. By the 2nd week, Margaret has stopped counting the roses on the wallpaper, not because she has lost interest in them, but because she has counted them so many times that the number has become meaningless, a fact she knows the way she knows her own name, without any sense of discovery attached to it. She has begun to notice things about the room that she did not notice in the first days. The way the afternoon light, filtered through the narrow gap in the curtains, moves across the floor as the hours pass, a thin gold blade that she can track almost to the minute if she watches closely enough, and watching closely has become, by necessity, one of the only activities available to her. She has also begun to lose track, in small but disorienting ways, of ordinary physical competencies she once possessed without thought. Her legs, unused for 2 weeks now beyond the brief assisted movements required for bathing, have begun to feel strange to her, distant somehow, as though they belong to someone else's body and she is merely borrowing them. When Miss Halloran helps her sit up slightly higher against the pillows one afternoon, Margaret is startled by how much effort the small adjustment requires, how her arms tremble faintly with the strain of an action that would have been entirely unremarkable 6 weeks ago. This is not an accident of the treatment. It is in a very direct sense the treatment working as intended, though not in the way anyone has explained it to Margaret. The theory Mitchell has built holds that this enforced weakness is temporary, a necessary low point on the path to eventual restoration. What the theory does not account for, or does not care to account for, is the psychological experience of watching your own body become foreign to you, of feeling your competence, your independence, your basic physical selfhood erode day by day inside a room you are not permitted to leave. Let us stop here for a moment and talk about why this exact combination of stillness, isolation, and forced feeding was considered by the leading medical minds of the era to be not just acceptable, but authentically therapeutic, because the logic behind it reveals something essential about how Victorian medicine understood the female body, and it is not the logic most people assume. The prevailing medical theory of the late 19th century held that the human body contained a fixed, finite reserve of nervous energy, sometimes described in the literature as nerve force, a quantity that could be spent but never expanded. This was not considered a metaphor. Physicians of Mitchell's generation genuinely believed that nervous energy functioned according to something like the laws of physics, a closed system in which energy expended in one direction was unavailable for use in another. And crucially, they believed that women's bodies allocated a significant portion of this finite energy toward reproductive function, toward the demands of menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, and lactation, in a way that men's bodies did not. This belief produced a specific and, from a modern vantage point, deeply strange conclusion. If a woman's reproductive system claimed a large share of her limited nervous energy by default, then any additional energy she spent on intellectual pursuits, on sustained reading, on writing, on the kind of demanding mental engagement that men were encouraged to pursue in their professional lives. Education, in this framework, was not merely unnecessary for women. It was actively dangerous, a direct threat to their capacity to bear healthy children and maintain the delicate balance their bodies required. This is one of those details that changes the entire picture. The rest cure was not simply a treatment for exhaustion. It was, in its underlying logic, a treatment designed to redirect a woman's nervous energy away from her mind and back toward her body's reproductive purpose. Every element of the regimen served this goal. The forced feeding rebuilt physical mass and, by extension, physical fertility. The prohibition on reading and writing prevented any further drain on the nervous reserves that should, by rights, belong to the womb. The enforced passivity retrained a woman's entire relationship to activity itself, teaching her, through 6 weeks of repetition, that stillness and submission were not merely tolerable, but actively healthy, while independence and intellectual engagement were symptoms to be corrected. There is a particular cruelty embedded in this logic that deserves to be named directly. Women most likely to be diagnosed with hysteria and prescribed the rest cure were disproportionately the women who had shown the most intellectual promise before their illness. Writers. Women who had attended the newer, more rigorous schools opening for girls in this era. Women who asked questions, who held opinions, who resisted the narrow boundaries of Victorian domesticity with anything more than passive discomfort. The very qualities that made these women exceptional were, within the medical framework of the time, recast as the direct cause of their breakdown. The cure for being too intelligent, too curious, too restless within an intolerable role was to be made. Systematically, less of all three. Margaret does not know any of this theory in the technical language the physicians use to describe it, but she is beginning, in the second week of her confinement, to feel its effects with a clarity that no medical text could convey. She is becoming day by day less herself, and the doctors who check on her progress, who visit twice weekly to assess her condition, seem to regard this diminishment not as a warning sign, but as evidence that the cure is taking hold. While Margaret lies in her curtained room, life at the brownstone continues without her, and it is worth pausing on what that continuation actually looks like, because it reveals something about the specific loneliness of her confinement that Margaret herself, sealed away from any news of home, cannot fully appreciate. Henry manages the household with the help of a housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Pruitt, who has served the family for years, and who takes on, without complaint, the additional burden of overseeing the nursery in Margaret's absence. The children are fed, clothed, and put to bed on schedule. The household accounts are kept imperfectly by Henry himself, who discovers, within the first 2 weeks of his wife's absence, just how many small, unglamorous tasks her daily management of the home had quietly absorbed. Henry writes to the physician overseeing Margaret's treatment twice during the 6 weeks, brief notes inquiring after her progress, and receives back reassuring clinical summaries that tell him almost nothing of substance. Improving steadily, responding well to the regimen, no cause for concern. He reads these notes with the relief of a man who trusts medical authority completely, who has no reason, given everything he has been taught to believe about nervous illness and its treatment, to imagine that his wife's actual experience might bear little resemblance to the calm. He visits once, in the 4th week, standing outside the closed door of Margaret's room, because he is not permitted to enter, and asks Miss Halloran, through the door, how his wife is faring. Miss Halloran's answer is professionally reassuring. Margaret cannot hear this exchange clearly enough to make out the words, only the low murmur of voices on the other side of a door that might as well, for all the difference it makes to her isolation, be a wall of solid stone. She lies in bed, straining to catch some fragment of her husband's voice, some confirmation that he is truly there, just beyond a door she is forbidden to open, and the nearness of that unreachable presence is in its own way. It is the beginning of the 3rd week when the massage begins, and Margaret has been told to expect it as a welcome development, sign that her treatment is advancing toward its next stage. Mitchell's regimen, whatever its cruelties, was not designed around pure stillness alone. He understood correctly that 6 to 8 weeks of total immobility would leave a patient's muscles severely weakened, perhaps dangerously so, and his solution was to introduce a daily regimen of vigorous full-body massage administered by a trained masseuse, intended to maintain muscle tone and circulation without requiring the patient to move under her own power. The masseuse who attends Margaret is a broad-shouldered woman named Mrs. Corbett, whose hands Margaret discovers on the first session possess a strength that seems entirely disproportionate to the gentle restorative purpose the treatment is meant to serve. Mrs. Corbett has practiced this trade for over a decade, moving between the households of several physicians who specialize in nervous complaints, and she performs her work with the brisk, unsentimental competence of someone who has long since stopped seeing the individual patient beneath the routine. She does not ask Margaret how she is feeling, beyond the most basic clinical inquiry about pain thresholds and areas of specific stiffness. She works largely in silence, moving through a sequence of motions so practiced they have become almost mechanical, and Margaret comes to understand, over the following weeks, that this silence is not unkindness so much as professional habit, the accumulated distance of a woman who has performed this same service on dozens of nervous, frightened patients, and has learned for her own sake as much as theirs, not to absorb too much of what passes through the room during her hour with each one. The massage is not the light, soothing touch that the word might suggest to a modern ear. It is deep, forceful, and often painful, kneading and pressing into muscle tissue that has grown stiff and unresponsive from weeks of disuse. Margaret grits her teeth through the first session and says nothing, because she has learned by now that pain expressed aloud is recorded as a symptom rather than a legitimate complaint. The massage lasts nearly an hour each day, moving systematically over her arms, her legs, her back, her abdomen. Mrs. Corbett's hands working with a mechanical thoroughness that leaves Margaret bruised in places by the second week of the sessions. When Margaret finally does mention, tentatively, that the pressure sometimes feels excessive, the response she receives from both Mrs. A. Corbett and the supervising physician is that discomfort is an expected and necessary part of the process. Evidence that circulation is being restored to tissue that has grown stagnant. The possibility that the massage itself might simply be too rough, administered without sufficient attention to an individual patient's tolerance, is not entertained as a serious concern. Alongside the massage, in the fourth week, comes something Margaret finds considerably more frightening: electrotherapy. The physician arrives one afternoon with a compact wooden case containing a battery-powered device and a set of electrodes, and he explains, the calm, instructive tone he uses for all his explanations, that mild electrical stimulation will be applied to her muscles to further encourage nervous and physical recovery. This is not, in 1880, an unusual or fringe treatment. Electrotherapy has been part of respectable medical practice for decades by this point, used to treat everything from paralysis to digestive complaints to, as in Margaret's case, nervous exhaustion. And physicians of the era regard the mild electrical current as a scientifically sound method of directly stimulating underactive nerves and muscles back into healthy function. The sensation, when the electrodes are first applied to her arm, is a sharp, unpleasant tingling that makes Margaret flinch involuntarily, and the physician notes this reaction, writing something in the small notebook he carries, though he does not tell her what he has written. The treatment moves over the following sessions to her back, to her legs, and, in a detail that Margaret finds most difficult to describe even to herself in the privacy of her own thoughts, to her lower abdomen and pelvic region. She endures these sessions in silence, staring at the faded roses on the wallpaper, willing herself to a kind of internal stillness that has nothing to do with the physical stillness her body has already been forced into for weeks. The equipment itself is, by the standards of any era, a strange thing to have present in a bedroom, otherwise dominated by pillows and heavy quilts and the soft domestic clutter of an invalid's room. The device the physician carries is a galvanic battery, a wooden case housing wet cells that generate a low, steady electrical current connected by insulated wires to a pair of metal electrodes, sometimes wrapped in dampened cloth to improve contact with the skin. The physician adjusts the intensity of the current with a small dial, watching Margaret's face for signs of response, increasing the strength incrementally until he judges the muscle beneath the electrode has been sufficiently stimulated. There is no anesthetic, no numbing preparation of any kind, because the sensation, uncomfortable as it is understood to be the therapeutic mechanism itself, not an unfortunate side effect to be minimized. The physician keeps a careful log of each session, noting the intensity of current applied, the duration of stimulation, and Margaret's observed response, building a written record that reads when Margaret glimpses a page of it once by accident, less like a compassionate account of a suffering woman's care, and more like a technical report on the calibration of an instrument. Margaret comes, over the following sessions, to dread this part of the day more than any other element of her confinement, more even than the forced feeding, more than the aggressive massage. There is something about the electrical current, its precision, its clinical deliberateness, the way it makes her muscles contract involuntarily under the physician's direction rather than her own will, that strikes her as a violation more total. Her body, already reduced to something managed and adjusted by other people, ceases even to respond to stimuli on its own terms. It responds, instead, to the turn of a dial in someone else's hand. She never voices this dread aloud. She has learned, by the 4th week, precisely what happens to patients who voice their discomfort too plainly, and so she lies still and breathes evenly and lets the current do what it will, cataloging the sensation privately, in the only space still fully her own, the silent interior of her own mind. It was not a cure. It was a behavioral modification program, and every element of it, the isolation, the forced feeding, the aggressive massage, the electrical stimulation, worked in concert toward a single outcome, whether or not any individual physician consciously understood it in these terms. The outcome was compliance. This is worth stating plainly, because the romanticized image of Victorian womanhood, the delicate lady on her chaise lounge, being fanned and pampered through a period of gentle convalescence, has almost nothing in common with what actually happened inside rooms like the one Margaret occupies. There was no pampering here. There was a systematic dismantling of a woman's autonomy, piece by piece, until the version of herself capable of resistance had been worn down to something quieter, more pliable, and more willing to accept whatever limited existence awaited her outside these walls. The psychological dimension of the treatment operated with precise, deliberate calculation. Patients who wept, who expressed frustration, who questioned the physician's instructions, who showed any visible sign of emotional distress were understood within the treatment's own logic to be resisting the cure, still gripped by the nervous excitability that had brought them to treatment in the first place. The prescribed response to this resistance was not adjustment of the regimen, but intensification of it, longer periods of isolation, stricter enforcement of the rules. A patient who complained too much might find her course of treatment extended by weeks, told that her continued distress was proof that the underlying nervous condition remained unresolved. Consider what this created, in practical terms, for a woman in Margaret's position. Every incentive available to her pointed in a single direction. Compliance, difficult as it was, requiring her to suppress her own genuine reactions to genuinely difficult circumstances, would be rewarded with an end to the treatment. Resistance, justified as it might be, a rational response to isolation and pain and the loss of everything that made her days feel like her own, would be punished with more of the same. The women who survived the rest cure most quickly were not, as a rule, the women who fought hardest against it. They were the women who learned fastest and most convincingly, to perform the calm, docile submission the treatment was designed to produce. The physician's bi-weekly visits become, over the course of the treatment, a small, strange ritual that Margaret comes to anticipate with a mixture of hope and dread. He arrives punctually, always in the early afternoon, and Miss Halloran opens the curtains an inch or two further than usual for the duration of his visit, allowing him better light by which to examine his patient. He sits in the single chair, positioned beside the bed, opens his small leather notebook, and asks his questions in the same order every time, a sequence Margaret has memorized by the third week. How has her sleep been? Has her appetite improved? Has she experienced any return of her nervous excitability? Any tears? Any agitation? Any of the specific symptoms that brought her here? Margaret answers these questions with increasing care as the weeks progress, having learned, through observation rather than instruction, exactly which answers move her treatment forward and which answers extend it. She reports sleep as improving even on nights when it has not. She reports her appetite as strong even as the force feeding continues to leave her nauseated most afternoons. She reports calm, always calm, regardless of what she has actually felt in the hours since his last visit. The physician records her answers in his notebook, nods with evident satisfaction, and occasionally makes a small adjustment to her regimen, an increase in the quantity of milk prescribed, a lengthening of the daily massage session, changes that Margaret receives without protest, because protest is read as evidence that the adjustment was necessary. He speaks to her during these visits in the tone of a kind but distant instructor, addressing a pupil whose progress he is monitoring rather than a grown woman being consulted about her own body and mind. He does not ask her opinion of her own treatment. He does not ask what she believes might actually help her. The entire structure of the visit assumes that Margaret's own account of her inner experience is, at best, an unreliable data point to be weighed against his own clinical judgment, and at worst, itself a symptom of the very disorder he has been called in to correct. It was not always this way. There was a night in the middle of the fourth week that Margaret does not tell anyone about. Not Henry, not her physician at home, not anyone who asks in the years that follow how her treatment went. It happens after a session of electrotherapy that leaves her more shaken than usual, the current applied for longer than previous sessions at the doctor's instruction, because he has noted in his little book that her progress has plateaued and believes a stronger dose of stimulation might push her forward. That night, alone in the dark, with Miss Halloran breathing steadily in the cot at the foot of the bed, something in Margaret finally gives way. She begins to cry, quietly at first, and then without any ability to stop herself, great heaving sobs that she presses her face into the pillow to muffle, terrified of waking the nurse, and terrified in some deeper way she cannot fully articulate even to herself, of what this loss of control might mean for how much longer she will be kept here. Miss Halloran wakes anyway. Of course she wakes. That is, part why she sleeps in this room at all. She sits up, lights a small lamp, and looks at Margaret with an expression that is not unkind. Exactly, but that carries the deep weariness of someone who has seen this exact moment many times before and knows precisely how to categorize it. She asks Margaret what is wrong. Margaret, unable to stop the crying long enough to construct the careful, acceptable answer she has learned to give, tells her the truth, that she misses her children unbearably, that she does not know if her daughter has learned to walk without her there to see it, that she cannot bear one more day in this room, in this darkness, in this silence that has come to feel less like rest and more like being slowly erased. Miss Halloran listens to all of this with professional patience, and then she does something that will teach Margaret more about the actual purpose of this treatment than anything the physician has told her directly. She makes a note. Not a comforting word, not a promise to pass along Margaret's longing for her children, but a written note in the small book that records Margaret's daily progress for the physician's review. And when the physician visits 2 days later, his tone toward Margaret has shifted, subtly but unmistakably, into something more cautious, more clinical. He tells her that Miss Halloran has reported a setback, that her emotional excitability on the night in question suggests the nervous system remains more unsettled than her recent progress indicated. He extends her course of treatment by an additional 2 weeks. Margaret does not cry again after that, not because the grief has resolved itself, but because she has learned, in the sharpest and most direct way, this treatment can teach a lesson exactly what the cost of visible feeling actually is. From that night forward, whatever she experiences internally, however much she continues to miss her children, or resent the confinement, or grieve the poem she can no longer remember, she keeps it entirely behind a face that shows nothing but calm, grateful compliance. It is this face, perfected over the 2 additional weeks her honesty has cost her, that the physician will eventually read, with satisfaction, as evidence for full and successful recovery. By the 7th week, which is where her treatment now stands after the extension, Margaret has become very good at this performance. When the physician visits and asks how she is feeling, she reports calm restfulness, a gradual return of appetite and strength, all phrases she has absorbed from the specific vocabulary of recovery that Miss Halloran and the physician himself use in her presence. She has learned to arrange her face into an expression of placid contentment during the massage and the electrical treatments, regardless of what she actually feels underneath that expression. She has stopped, almost entirely, mentioning her children, her husband, or anything from her life outside this room, because she has noticed, with the sharp adaptive intelligence that even 2 months of enforced stillness cannot fully erase, that these mentions are noted with slight concern, while their absence is read as a sign of healthy detachment and progress. What none of the physicians observing her seem to recognize, or perhaps what none of them wish to recognize, is that this transformation, this quieting, this careful, practiced blankness that Margaret has learned to present, it is a survival strategy adopted by a woman who has correctly understood that her freedom depends on convincing the people holding her here that she no longer needs it. Let us step back from Margaret's confinement for a moment and look at something that touches everything we have been watching, because the contrast is stark enough to reveal, more clearly than anything else in this story, exactly what the rescuer was actually designed to accomplish. Silas Weir Mitchell did not treat only women. Men too came to him suffering from neurasthenia, from the same nervous exhaustion, the same insomnia and anxiety and depletion that afflicted his female patients. And for these men, Mitchell prescribed something almost entirely different. Where women were sent to bed, isolated in darkened rooms for 6 to 8 weeks, men suffering from the identical diagnosis were frequently prescribed what came to be known formally as the West Cure. Vigorous outdoor activity, travel to the American frontier, horseback riding, hunting, camping, physical exertion in open air and wide landscapes, all of it encouraged as the appropriate remedy for a nervous system in need of restoration. The novelist Owen Wister, who would go on to write The Virginian, one of the founding works of American Western fiction, was himself a patient of Mitchell's, treated for nervous exhaustion with a prescription that sent him to Wyoming, where he rode horses across open country and returned, by his own account, transformed. Theodore Roosevelt's own retreat to the Dakota Badlands after personal tragedy, though not formally a case managed by Mitchell, reflected the same underlying cultural logic, that a man's nerves were restored through action, through mastery of a wild landscape, through the assertion of physical will against the natural world. Mitchell wrote about this gendered distinction with a frankness that leaves little room for ambiguity about his underlying assumptions. In his professional writing, he described men and women as possessing fundamentally different relationships to activity and rest. Men built for exertion and requiring an outlet for their natural vigor. Women built for a more delicate equilibrium, easily disrupted by exactly the kind of exertion that restored a man to health. This was not, in Mitchell's mind, a double standard requiring justification. It was simply an accurate description of biological reality as he understood it, as self-evident to him as the observation that men and women's bodies differed in size and strength. The idea that a woman's nervous exhaustion might respond just as well, or better, to vigorous outdoor activity as a man's never seriously entered his clinical consideration. Not because the evidence pointed against it, but because the entire framework he operated within. Consider what this means, placed directly beside Margaret's experience. The same diagnosis, applied to two different bodies, produced two entirely opposite treatments. A man's exhausted nerves called for expansion, movement, adventure, the wide open promise of the American West. A woman's exhausted nerves called for contraction, stillness, darkness, and total submission to the authority of the people caring for her. The underlying medical theory was ostensibly identical in both cases, a depleted nervous system in need of restoration. But the treatment revealed, with a clarity that no amount of clinical language could obscure, what each sex was actually believed to need, and what each sex was actually believed to be for. A man recovering his nerves was expected to return to the world larger, stronger, more capable than before, ready to resume his place in the vigorous public life of commerce and ambition. A woman recovering her nerves was expected to return to her household, smaller, quieter, and more compliant than before, ready to resume her place within the narrow domestic sphere that had, in many cases, contributed to her breakdown in the first place. The West cure expanded a man's world. The rest cure contracted a woman's world down to the dimensions of a single curtained room, and then, upon her release, back to the dimensions of a household she was never meant to leave in any meaningful sense at all. This is one of those details that changes the entire picture, and it is worth returning to Margaret now with this contrast fully in view, because her final weeks in that room will make a great deal more sense once you understand exactly what outcome her treatment was built to produce. By the 8th week, Margaret has gained a considerable amount of weight, a fact the physician notes with evident satisfaction on each of his visits. Her face, once thin and drawn, has filled out. Her arms, though still weak from disuse, no longer show the sharp definition of bone beneath skin that first alarmed her husband. By the measurable standards the treatment sets for itself, weight gained, appetite restored, sleep reportedly improved. Margaret is a success. The physician tells her on his final visit before her discharge that she has responded beautifully to the cure, that her nervous system has been thoroughly restored, and that she may look forward to resuming her domestic duties with renewed strength and equilibrium. What the physician cannot measure, because it exists nowhere on the chart he keeps, is what Margaret has actually learned during these 8 weeks. She has learned that her own perceptions, her own reports of pain, hunger, exhaustion, distress, carry no weight against the judgment of the people supervising her. She has learned that emotional expression, however genuine, will be read as a symptom rather than a communication. She has learned, most importantly, that the fastest route out of confinement is not honesty, but performance. The careful construction of exactly the calm, compliant surface that her doctors want to see. On the morning of her discharge, Miss Halloran helps her dress in clothes that no longer fit quite the way they did 2 months ago, her body having changed under the forced feeding in ways that leave the fabric straining at the waist and shoulders. Margaret stands in front of the small mirror in the corner of the room, the first time she has seen her own reflection in over a month. And the woman looking back at her is both familiar and strange. Heavier, paler, despite the weight gain, with an expression around the eyes. Henry arrives to collect her in the early afternoon, and his relief at seeing her is immediate and visible, spreading across his face the moment she descends the stairs. He tells her she looks well. He tells her the children have missed her terribly, that their son has asked after her every day, that their daughter has grown so much in 2 months she will hardly recognize her own mother. Margaret listens to this with the placid, receptive expression she has spent these final weeks perfecting, and something in her, watching Henry's genuine happiness, understands with a kind of quiet, exhausted clarity that she will never tell him what those 8 weeks actually contain. Not the massage that left bruises, not the electrical treatment applied to parts of her body she has no comfortable language to describe even to herself. Not the exact texture of 2 months spent staring at faded roses on a wall, watching a blade of afternoon light track across a floor, counting hours that refuse to pass at any recognizable speed. She smiles at Henry. She tells him she is glad to be home. Both of these things are, in their own way, true, and both of them conceal far more than they reveal. The carriage ride back to the brownstone passes in a blur of ordinary sights that feel, to Margaret, almost violently vivid after 2 months of the same dim room. Storefronts, passers-by on the sidewalk, bundled against the cold. The grey of a February sky she has not seen in over a month. She watches all of it through the carriage window, with an attention that borders on hunger, cataloguing details the way a starving person might catalogue food. And Henry, watching her watch the city, mistakes this hunger for simple pleasure. He does not ask what she is actually feeling. It does not occur to him that there might be a difference. At home, the children are brought to her in the parlor, and the reunion is, on its surface, exactly what everyone hoped it would be. Her son runs to her with his arms already open. Her daughter, toddling now, more steadily than Margaret remembered, hesitates for a moment at the strangeness of her mother's face before recognition breaks across her features, and she reaches up to be held. Margaret gathers both children against her, and the tears that come are entirely genuine, the first unguarded emotion she has allowed herself in 2 months. And Henry, watching from the doorway, feels his own eyes grow wet at the sight of his family reunited. What he does not see, because it exists nowhere on the surface of this scene, is the quiet calculation running underneath his wife's tears. Even now, even in this moment of real feeling, Margaret is aware of herself being watched, aware that her son's account of this reunion, innocent as it is, will circulate through the household and eventually reach the physician's ears if anything about her behavior seems amiss. She has learned, over these 2 months, to perform even her genuine emotions with one eye on how they will be read by the people who hold power over her. This is the quiet inheritance of the rest cure that no medical chart records. Not a cure, but a new and permanent wariness, a habit of self-monitoring that will outlast the treatment itself by years, perhaps by the whole remainder of a life. Margaret's story, drawn as it is from the pattern of dozens of real case histories, ends here in the relative privacy of an ordinary household, her true experience folded away and never fully spoken aloud to anyone. Most women who underwent the rest cure left no detailed record of what those weeks actually felt like from the inside. They returned to their households, resumed their duties, and carried the experience forward in silence, the way Margaret will carry hers. But one woman did not stay silent. One woman took the 6 weeks that were meant to erase her and turned them into one of the most quietly devastating pieces of writing in American literature, and mailed a copy directly to the doctor who had tried to cure her of thinking. Her name was Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and her story is where we go next. Charlotte Perkins Gilman was born in 1860 into a family with a distinguished intellectual pedigree and a childhood marked by financial instability after her father abandoned the household when she was still young. Her family connections were, in their way, remarkable. She was a grandniece of Harriet Beecher Stowe, the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin and of several other prominent Beecher family intellectuals and reformers, a lineage steeped in exactly the kind of public engagement and social conviction that Victorian medicine considered so dangerous for women to pursue. Her father, Frederick Beecher Perkins, was himself a librarian and writer of some accomplishment, but he left the family when Charlotte was still a young child, and her mother raised her and her brother alone, in circumstances that shifted frequently between relative comfort and genuine hardship. The family sometimes taking in boarders or moving between relatives' homes to manage expenses. This unstable, financially precarious childhood shaped Gilman's character in ways that would prove significant later. She grew up reading widely, thinking independently, and developing well before her marriage a set of convictions about women's independence and self-sufficiency that put her at odds with the domestic expectations of her era. She earned a modest income as a young woman through art instruction and design work, valued her autonomy fiercely, and approached the prospect of marriage with genuine ambivalence, aware with an unusual clarity for a woman of her time that marriage and motherhood might come at a significant cost to the independent life she had built for herself. She married Charles Walter Stetson, an aspiring artist, in 1884, and the ambivalence she had felt beforehand proved, in the months that followed, to be entirely justified. Her daughter, Catherine, was born in March of 1885, and almost immediately afterward, Gilman fell into a depression so severe and so persistent that she would later describe it, in her own words, as a nervous breakdown tending toward melancholia and beyond. The condition we would now recognize with the benefit of modern psychiatric understanding as severe postpartum depression, compounded by the loss of the professional and creative life she had built before her marriage, had no adequate name in the medical vocabulary available to her physicians. It had only the old familiar label: nervous prostration, hysteria. In 1887, desperate for relief from a despair that had left her barely able to function, Gilman traveled to Philadelphia to consult the most celebrated specialist in nervous disease in the entire country, Silas Weir Mitchell himself. Mitchell examined Gilman with the confidence of a physician who believed, entirely sincerely, that he understood her condition and its remedy. He diagnosed her with neurasthenia and prescribed his standard course of treatment, a version of the rest cure tailored to what he judged to be her specific case. The instructions he gave her upon her discharge, preserved because Gilman recorded them herself in her later writing, are worth hearing in full because they capture, with a precision no historian's summary could match, exactly what Mitchell believed a woman like Gilman needed in order to recover. "Live as domestic a life as possible," he told her. "Have your child with you at all times. Lie down for an hour after every meal. Have but 2 hours of intellectual life a day. and never touch pen, brush, or pencil again as long as you live. Consider the specific cruelty of that final instruction, delivered to a woman whose entire sense of self, whose entire capacity for meaning and expression was built around the act of writing. Mitchell was not simply prescribing rest. He was prescribing the permanent amputation of the one activity that gave Gilman's life its shape and purpose. And he was prescribing it as medicine, with the full authority of his professional reputation behind the instruction. Gilman followed this advice, by her own later account, for approximately 3 months. And in her own words, written years afterward in an essay explaining why she had written her most famous story, she came, during those months, so near the borderline of utter mental ruin that she could see over it. The specific mechanism of this near collapse deserves attention because it illuminates something essential about what the rest cure actually did to a mind like hers. Deprived of intellectual engagement, deprived of the outlet that had always helped her process and organize her own thoughts, Gilman found her mental state deteriorating rather than improving. The prescribed inactivity, rather than restoring her, seemed to accelerate the very collapse it was meant to prevent. At some point during this period, Gilman made a decision that would prove to be, in retrospect, one of the most consequential acts of quiet rebellion in the history of American literature. She decided, against Mitchell's explicit instructions, to write. Not immediately, and not without considerable fear about what this defiance might cost her, but gradually, in stolen hours, in whatever intellectual space she could carve out of a life that had been designed to eliminate exactly this kind of activity, Gilman began composing what would become The Yellow Well Pair, a short story told in the form of secret diary entries kept by a woman confined by her physician husband to a single room for a rest cure remarkably similar to the one Gilman herself had endured. The story follows its narrator through a summer of enforced isolation in a country house, confined to a nursery room with barred windows and a bed bolted to the floor, its walls covered in a repulsive, sprawling yellow wallpaper that the narrator, forbidden any other occupation for her mind, becomes increasingly obsessed with. She begins to see a figure trapped behind the paper's chaotic pattern, a woman crawling, struggling, trying to escape from behind the visible surface of the design. As the story progresses, the narrator's obsession with this trapped figure intensifies, and by the final pages, she has come to identify herself entirely with the woman she believes is imprisoned in the wallpaper, tearing at the paper in a desperate effort to free her, ultimately merging, in the story's final and most unsettling image, with the very figure she has spent the summer trying to liberate. It is, on its surface, a horror story, but it is also, and this is the reading that has made it one of the most studied works of American fiction, a precise and devastating account of exactly what the rest cure did to the women who underwent it, rendered in fiction because the truth told plainly, or might not have been publishable at all in the moral climate of 1892. Gilman wrote the story, by her own account, in about 2 days, a burst of concentrated effort that stands in stark contrast to the years of enforced silence that preceded it, as though the story had been assembling itself, fully formed, somewhere in the back of her mind through all those months of prescribed emptiness. She sent it to a magazine editor who, upon reading it, wrote back expressing genuine unease, telling her that the story had disturbed him so deeply he could not bear the thought of anyone else experiencing that same disturbance after reading it. He declined to publish it. Gilman, undeterred, sent the manuscript elsewhere, and in January of 1892, the New England magazine finally printed it. The initial reception was mixed and revealing in its own right. Some readers wrote to praise the story's unsettling power without fully grasping, or perhaps without wanting to fully grasp, the specific medical critique buried inside it. Others understood exactly what Gilman was doing and objected strenuously. One physician wrote a letter to the editor of a prominent magazine arguing that stories like Gilman's should not be published at all, on the grounds that they might discourage nervous patients from seeking the very treatment that could cure them. An objection that, read now, functions as an almost perfect, done intentional confirmation of everything the story was trying to say. The medical establishment's first instinct, faced with a woman's account of what its treatment had actually felt like from the inside, was not to investigate the claim, but to suppress its circulation. Gilman completed the story, and in an act whose audacity deserves to be understood fully, sent a copy of the published piece directly to Silas Weir Mitchell. There is no definitive record of Mitchell's private reaction to receiving it, but Gilman herself later claimed with evident satisfaction that she had heard, second-hand, that Mitchell had altered his treatment of nervous patients after reading her story, a claim that historians have found difficult to verify with certainty. Woman he had tried to silence had written her way, not only out of his prescribed erasure, but into a position from which she could speak back to the entire medical establishment that had tried to erase her. The rest of Gilman's life bore out the promise of that rebellion. She went on to become one of the most influential feminist thinkers and writers of her era, producing work on economics, sociology, and the structural conditions of women's dependence that remains studied and cited today. Her 1898 book, Women in Economics, argued with a rigor that drew serious engagement from economists and social theorists of her time that women's economic dependence on men was the root structural cause of their broader social subordination. An argument built on the same clear-eyed analytical capacity that Mitchell had once tried to convince her was dangerous to her health. She lectured widely, edited her own magazine for several years, writing nearly all of its content herself, and remained, for the rest of her working life, one of the most visible and productive intellectual figures. She left her marriage to Stetson, unusual and scandalous for a woman of her era, and built an independent intellectual life that the rest cure had been explicitly designed to prevent her from ever having. The decision cost her socially. Custody arrangements of the era typically favored fathers. When Stetson remarried, Gilman made the difficult choice to send her daughter Catherine to live with him and his new wife, a decision she defended publicly as being in her daughter's best interest, but one that drew considerable public criticism. Criticism that fell along exactly the lines you would expect for a woman who had already been diagnosed once as insufficiently maternal by the standards of her era. She later remarried to her first cousin George Houghton Gilman, a partnership by most accounts happier and more equal than her first, and continued writing and lecturing well into the 20th century. She did not, in the end, do as she was told. She touched pen, brush, and pencil for the rest of her working life, and the story she wrote about the treatment meant to stop her has outlived nearly everything else written about the rest cure, including Mitchell's own celebrated medical text. Let us step back once more, because Gilman's rebellion did not happen in a vacuum. It happened at a moment when the entire edifice of Victorian medical thinking about women was beginning, slowly and unevenly, to show its first cracks. By the final decades of the 19th century, the world that had produced the rest cure was already changing in ways that would eventually make the treatment impossible to sustain. The movement for women's higher education was gaining real momentum, with colleges opening their doors to female students in numbers that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier, producing, in the process, a growing body of evidence that directly contradicted the medical orthodoxy Mitchell had built his career upon. If intellectual exertion truly damaged a woman's reproductive health and nervous stability, the graduates of these new institutions should have shown it. Instead, study after study conducted in the following decades found that educated women were, if anything, healthier and longer-lived than their less educated counterparts, a finding that quietly undermined the entire theoretical foundation. The suffrage movement, too, was gathering strength through these same decades, and its activists, women who organized, spoke publicly, wrote pamphlets, and endured considerable hostility in pursuit of political rights, offered a living rebuttal to the idea that female minds and bodies were simply incapable of sustained public engagement. A movement built on the visible competence and endurance of women in public life could not comfortably coexist in the long run, with a medical establishment insisting that women's nerves were too fragile for exactly this kind of activity. Within medicine itself, new frameworks were beginning to emerge that would eventually displace the crude, mechanical model of finite nervous energy that had underwritten Mitchell's entire system. The early work that would eventually develop into psychoanalysis and modern psychology was beginning to suggest, however imperfectly in its earliest forms, that mental distress might have psychological rather than purely physiological origins. That a woman's depression might be a response to her actual circumstances rather than a defect in the wiring of her nerves. These ideas would take decades to fully mature and would carry their own significant limitations and blind spots, but their earliest stirrings, in the very years that Gilman was writing The Yellow Welber, represented the first serious intellectual challenge to the framework that had made the rest cure seem not just acceptable, but scientifically necessary. None of this changed things quickly. The rest cure remained a respected treatment well into the 20th century, prescribed by physicians trained in Mitchell's methods for decades after his death in 1914. Virginia Woolf, writing decades after Gilman in England rather than America, would describe her own experiences with rest cure treatments during her lifelong struggles with mental illness in terms that echo Gilman's account almost precisely: the same infantilizing surveillance, disguised as medical care. Woolf's physicians, treating her across multiple breakdowns between the 1,890 seconds, prescribed regimens strikingly similar to the one Margaret endured. Extended bed rest, restrictions on reading and writing, activities Woolf, like Gilman, considered essential to her own sense of self. Forced feeding to promote weight gain, milk and meat pressed on her by nurses instructed to monitor every meal. Woolf came to view these treatments with a bitterness that surfaces throughout her later fiction and diaries, most famously in her novel Mrs. Dalloway, where the character of Septimus Smith, a shell-shocked war veteran, is driven to suicide partly through his horror at the prospect of being sent away for a rest cure. Many scholars believe, on Woolf's own doctors, that a woman writing in the 1,920 seconds could still draw on the exact same treatment, the exact same vocabulary of confinement and control that had shaped Gilman's experience decades earlier in an entirely different country, tells you how deeply embedded this approach to women's mental health had become within respectable medicine on both sides of the Atlantic. The treatment's grip on respectable medicine loosened gradually, unevenly, and never entirely disappeared from practice until well into the new century. Mitchell himself lived to see some of this shift begin, though he never fully abandoned his conviction that his methods had genuinely helped the women he treated. He continued practicing medicine and writing both fiction and clinical texts, until his death in 1914, celebrated to the end of his career as one of the great American physicians of his generation, honored by medical societies. He never publicly reckoned, so far as the historical record shows, with the possibility that Gilman's story represented anything more than an unfortunate misreading of an otherwise sound therapeutic approach. Whatever private doubt the story may have planted in him, and Gilman's own later claims suggest, There may have been some. He did not record it for posterity in his own words. He died believing, or at least presenting himself as believing, that the rest cure had been one of the great humane achievements of his career, a genuine advance in the treatment of nervous suffering. History has judged him rather differently. Mitchell is remembered today, when he is remembered at all outside specialist medical history, primarily as the physician who inspired the yellow well pair, the man against whom Gilman's story continues to stand as evidence, the antagonist in a story that has long since outlived the treatment he considered his greatest professional achievement. There is a sharp irony in this, one Gilman herself might well have appreciated. The physician who instructed her never to touch pen, brush, or pencil again is remembered today largely because of the pen she refused to set down. Medical schools that once taught Mitchell's regimen as standard practice now teach the yellow well pair in their humanities curricula as a way of illustrating to a new generation of physicians exactly how confident, well-credentialed medical authority can cause genuine harm when it refuses to listen to the patient sitting in front of it. It is difficult to imagine a stranger, more complete reversal of fortune between a doctor and the patient who dared to write back. But the cracks were there visible if you knew where to look. In the very years that Margaret lay in her curtained room, counting roses on the wallpaper, the world outside that room was shifting slowly in ways that would eventually make her daughter's generation, and certainly her granddaughter's, far less likely to face the exact confinement Margaret endured. That shift came too late to help Margaret herself. It came too late to help most of the women who passed through rooms like hers. But it was coming, and Gilman's story, mailed directly to the man who had tried to silence her, was one of the small, specific acts that helped pull it forward. Let us return one final time to the room, because there is something to understand here that goes beyond any single woman's story, something about the patterns that repeat across every account we have gathered tonight. The first pattern is the most fundamental, and it is this: the diagnosis came before the evidence. Physicians of this era did not observe a consistent set of symptoms, trace them to a shared physical cause, and then develop hysteria as a label to describe that cause. They started with an assumption that women's minds and bodies were inherently more fragile than men's, more susceptible to disruption, less capable of sustaining the demands of intellectual or public life, and then they built an entire diagnostic and therapeutic apparatus to confirm that assumption. Every symptom a woman presented, however varied, no matter how clearly rooted in circumstances a modern observer would immediately recognize: exhaustion from unrelenting domestic labor, grief over a life narrower than her capabilities, depression following childbirth, could be folded into the same catch-all category, because the category was never designed to describe a specific illness. It was designed to describe deviation from an ideal, and any deviation would do. The second pattern concerns the specific women who were most likely to be targeted. Consider who filled these rooms. Not the women who accepted their circumstances without complaint, who found genuine contentment within the narrow boundaries of Victorian domesticity. The women who ended up under Mitchell's care and the care of physicians trained in his methods were disproportionately the readers, the writers, the questioners. The women who had shown some flicker of ambition or intellectual life before their marriages narrowed their world. Charlotte Perkins Gilman was not an anomaly among rescuer patients. She was, in a sense, the type. The treatment functioned, whether or not any individual physician consciously intended it, as a mechanism for identifying exactly the women whose minds posed the greatest challenge to the domestic order, and then systematically dismantling the capacities that made them a challenge in the first place. The third pattern is the weaponization of medical authority itself. Margaret's physician, and physicians like him across 2 continents, held a kind of power that is difficult to fully appreciate from a modern vantage point, where second opinions, patient advocacy, and at least the theoretical possibility of informed consent. In 1880, a woman diagnosed with hysteria had almost no recourse against her physician's authority. Her husband, in nearly every case, deferred entirely to medical judgment, in part because the medical judgment confirmed exactly what he already believed about his wife's fragility and his own responsibility to manage her well-being. The physician's word was, functionally, law within the household, and a woman who resisted that word, who insisted her own account of her body and mind deserved equal weight, only provided further evidence within the treatment's circular logic of the very hysterical excitability that justified her confinement in the first place. The 4th pattern is one that Margaret's story illustrates with particular clarity, though it runs through every account we have gathered tonight. Survival required self-erasure. The women who emerged from the breast cure fastest, who were judged most successfully cured, were not the women who somehow found genuine peace with their treatment. They were the women who learned, through whatever mixture of instinct and hard experience the room provided, to perform the specific emotional flatness their physicians were looking for. This is not resilience in any sense worth celebrating. And it is a kind of quiet violence, a training process that taught women to distrust their own perceptions, to treat their genuine feelings as dangerous evidence to be hidden rather than communication to be shared. A lesson that once learned does not simply disappear the moment the bedroom door opens and the treatment officially ends. The 5th pattern, and perhaps the one that deserves the most attention, is the total inversion of what health and sickness actually meant inside these rooms. A woman who wept, who protested, who insisted on her love for her children and her right to know how they were faring in her absence, was labeled unwell, still gripped by the very excitability the treatment was meant to correct. A woman who grew quiet, compliant, emotionally blank, who stopped asking questions and stopped expressing need, was labeled recovered. By any reasonable standard, this inversion should trouble us. The genuine, healthy human responses, grief, longing, protest against unjust confinement, were treated as symptoms of disease. The suppression of those responses, the flattening of a woman's inner life into something manageable and unthreatening, was treated as the very picture of restored health. Surviving the rest cure did not mean being healed. It meant learning to hide the healthy parts of yourself so thoroughly that the people watching mistook the hiding for a cure. The 6th and final pattern is the one revealed most clearly by the contrast between the rest cure and the west cure, and it is, in some ways, the pattern that contains all the others inside it. The 2 treatments, applied to men and women presenting with the same diagnosis, were never actually designed to cure the same underlying condition, whatever the shared medical vocabulary suggested. They were designed to return each patient to the role their society had already assigned them, more capable of fulfilling that role than before. A man's treatment expanded his capacity for independence, action, and public achievement, because that was what a recovered man was supposed to possess. A woman's treatment contracted her capacity for exactly those same qualities, because independence, action, and public achievement were never what a recovered woman was supposed to possess in the first place. The medicine was never neutral. It was never simply responding to a biological reality and prescribing whatever the body required. It was enforcing a social order and calling the enforcement science. These 6 patterns, taken together, describe something larger than a single, outdated medical practice. They describe a system, and systems once built tend to persist long after the individuals who designed them have died, and the theories that justified them have been discredited. The rest cure would eventually fall out of favor, as we have seen, as education, suffrage, and new psychological frameworks slowly eroded the foundations it stood on. But the underlying logic that women's distress is best managed through isolation and suppression, rather than genuine engagement with its causes, has proven remarkably durable in forms that extend well beyond the specific rooms Margaret and Charlotte Perkins Gilman once occupied. Let us return, finally, to Margaret's bedroom on the night of her first day home. The house is quiet by the time she finally climbs the stairs to her own bed, the one she shared with Henry before all of this began, in the room that overlooks the small back garden rather than the street. Henry is already asleep, or pretending to be, his breathing slow and even in the darkness. Margaret lies beside him for a long while without sleeping, listening to the ordinary sounds of her own house settling around her. A floorboard somewhere contracting in the cold, the faint creak of the stairs where the cat, unseen, makes its nightly patrol. She thinks about the poem she was composing before all of this began, the one whose third line she still cannot recall, no matter how many times she reaches for it in the quiet of her own mind. She wonders whether it is truly gone, lost somewhere in the 6 weeks of enforced blankness, or whether it is simply buried, waiting the way certain things wait in the body long after we have stopped looking for them. She does not reach for a pen tonight. She is not ready for that yet, and she understands with the same quiet, exhausted clarity that has governed her thinking since her discharge that reaching for one too soon, too visibly, might raise exactly the kind of concern that could return her to that curtained room. But she thinks about it. She lies in the dark and turns the idea over slowly, carefully, the way you might handle a delicate object you are not yet sure has survived a long fall. Not tonight. But perhaps, in time, in whatever private hours a life like hers still allows, something of what the treatment tried to take from her might find its way back. Downstairs, in the nursery on the floor above, her children sleep the deep, uncomplicated sleep of the very young, unaware of anything their mother has endured, unaware that the woman who tucked them in tonight is not quite the same woman who kissed them goodbye 8 weeks ago, and never fully will be again. Some of what the room took from her, she suspects she will not get back. Some small, specific confidence in her own perceptions, her own right to name what she feels without first calculating how that feeling will be received. That particular loss, she thinks, staring at the dark ceiling above her bed, may simply be the price the room extracted, quietly, permanently, in exchange for letting her go. In the months that follow, Margaret will resume the rhythms of her old life with a competence that satisfies everyone around her. She will manage the household, attend to her children, receive callers, and perform, in every visible respect, the picture of a woman fully restored. Her physician, on a follow-up visit some weeks after her discharge, will pronounce himself thoroughly satisfied with her progress, noting in his final case summary that the patient presents as calm, settled, and free of the nervous excitability that necessitated treatment. He will use her case, in conversations with colleagues, as an example of the rest cure's continued efficacy. What he will never know, because there is no clinical instrument capable of measuring it, is the small private negotiation Margaret conducts with herself almost daily for years afterward. A negotiation about how much of her inner life is safe to reveal, to Henry, to her children as they grow older, to anyone at all. She will, eventually, in careful and limited ways, return to writing, though never again with the open, unguarded ambition of her girlhood. She keeps a private notebook, hidden in the bottom of a trunk in the room that was once her study, and fills it slowly, over years, with fragments that never see publication, never see any eyes but her own. It is not the life she once imagined for herself, in the years before her marriage, when she still believed her intelligence might carry her somewhere beyond the walls of a household. But it is not nothing, either. It is a small, stubborn continuity of self, maintained in secret, in the only space the treatment never fully managed to reach. She never tells her daughter, in any direct way, what those 8 weeks contained. But there is perhaps something communicated anyway. In the close attention Margaret pays, years later, to her daughter's own education, in the book she quietly makes available, in the encouragement she offers carefully, without ever fully explaining why it matters so much to her that this next generation of women might have more room to think than she was ever permitted to keep. But she is home tonight. Her children are sleeping down the hall. Her husband, whatever he does or does not understand about what she endured, breathes steadily beside her, glad, in his own limited way, to have her back. And somewhere, though Margaret does not know this yet, in another house, in another city, another woman is lying awake in a curtained room of her own, staring at a pattern in the wallpaper, thinking, in the sharp, defiant privacy of a mind that no amount of enforced rest has managed to fully still, about a story she intends to write the moment she's allowed to hold a pen again. The house is quiet now. The last coal in the bedroom fireplace has burned down to a dull orange ember. Somewhere outside, a carriage passes on the street below, its wheels rattling over the cobblestones and then fading into silence. Margaret closes her eyes. Whatever tomorrow requires of her, whatever performance of calm and gratitude her household and her physician and her own careful survival still demand, it can wait until morning. For now, sleep. Wherever you are tonight, whatever the hour, I hope this was good company. Good night, friend. We have been somewhere real tonight.